Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
President Trump has threatened Nigeria with military action to tackle what he's claiming is targeted attacks on Christians.
They're killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria. And they have other countries very bad also. You know that part of the world very bad. They're killing the Christians and killing them in very large numbers. We're not going to allow that to happen.
Nigeria's government has said the claims do not reflect reality as Nigerian assets tumbled in the aftermath of Trump's threats.
It's impossible for there to be a religious persecution that can be supported in any way, shape, or form by the government of Nigeria at any level.
On today's podcast, we're discussing why Trump is focusing on Nigeria, where the false idea of a genocide against Christians is coming from, and why Nigeria might have to think carefully about how to respond. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. And joining me this week is Neil Munshi, Bloomberg's deputy managing editor for the Middle East and Africa, and our Abuja-based reporter, Nduka Orjino. Thank you both for joining us this week. Appreciate you both being here. Nduka, let's just start with you because there's quite a bit to unpack with the story. But we heard earlier those comments from President Trump on Air Force One over the weekend. We'll talk shortly about where some of those claims that he's making are coming from. But let's just start with what the president actually said, what the action is that he's threatening, and whether or not we've gotten any indication that he's going to follow through on this. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, let's start from Friday then. Trump posted on Truth Social, his own platform, that thousands of Christians have been killed in Nigeria. And then he blamed the radical Islamists, for being responsible for that mass murder. Then he went further in that same post to designate Nigeria a country of particular concern, which is usually reserved for countries that show clear and consistent patterns of religious discrimination or persecution. On Saturday, Trump then went
on today's
further
podcast, we're discussing why Trump is focusing on Nigeria, where the false idea of a genocide against Christians is coming from, and why Nigeria might have to think carefully about how to respond.
Immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria, and may very well, to use his own words now, go into that now disgraced country, guns are blazing. Then on Sunday, he was asked, whether he might call in airstrikes or send in ground troops. And he said a lot of things. At the moment, we haven't seen any movements to indicate that any of that is happening. It just still feels like it's the usual Trump rhetoric, but it hasn't really escalated to the point where he's sending either the ground troops he's talked about or, sending in any carriers into the West African coast. So nothing so far in terms of the military action, just talk from Trump and from the Nigerian government, which we'll get into later.
And the timing of this is quite interesting, of course, because we just saw the president doing his Asia trip. Now he starts to make these claims. Let's dig into the claims a bit, Neil, if you can jump in here. What do you make of the timing of this and why President Trump is starting to focus on Nigeria now?
In a sense, it was sort of a matter of time, right? So this kind of conspiracy theory around either persecution of Christians in Nigeria or a genocide against Christians in Nigeria has been circulated in right-wing Western circles and evangelical circles for years. And, Trump dipped into it a little bit in his first term when he similarly declared Nigeria a country of particular concern. Biden administration pulled them off that list. But in recent months, you've seen it kind of gaining steam. So, Senator Ted Cruz, a Trump ally, introduced a bill to protect Nigerian Christians. There was a sort of lesser known Republican congressman who did something similar. And you've heard more and more chatter about this. And so in a way, it was kind of the way Trump often does, kind of pick up on conspiracy theories that are floating among his base and then elevates them. That seems to be what happened here. And you can see it's broken out of the kind of traditional right-wing spheres in the case of, say, the comedian Bill Maher, who has a show on HBO every week. And I think we have a clip of him talking about it too.
If you don't know what's going on in Nigeria, your media sources suck. You are in a bubble. Not, and again, I'm not a Christian, but they are systematically killing the Christians in Nigeria. They've killed over 100,000 since 2009. They've burned 18,000 churches. These are their Islamists, Boko Haram. They are literally attempting to wipe out the Christian population of an entire country. Where are the kids protesting this?
So Bill Maher talking about this on his HBO show. What do we know about the actual picture in Nigeria on the ground there, Neil?
First off, in that clip, he says they're trying to systematically wipe out the entire Christian population of Nigeria. That's just absolutely factually inaccurate. Nigeria is a country of 230 million people. It is split roughly evenly between Christians and Muslims. It is also a country that has been racked by violence for decades that impacts all communities and all people across Nigeria. The way this violence is manifested over the last 15 years is kind of falls into a few buckets. One is jihadists and Islamists in the Northeast, Boko Haram being the most famous one, attacking villages, army convoys, churches, and Muslims too. In the Northwest, it's armed gangs of bandits who are criminals who have kidnapped and massacred thousands over the past 10 years. And then in the middle of the country, you have long-running conflict between largely sedentary and Christian farmers and nomadic cattle herders who are mostly Muslims. And there is where you see it shade most into religious violence. But again, most of the violence in the country is concentrated in the north, which is predominantly Muslim. So just kind of based on that, the proportion of victims, it's higher in the Muslim community than it is in the Christian community. But that is all to say that violence impacts everyone in Nigeria, and it is non-denominational. As the Boko Haram phenomenon and the kind of jihadist phenomenon has scaled back, the armed gangs of bandits riding around on motorcycles with AK-47s ramped up. And I think it should still be true today, but for a long period, were responsible for much more violence in the country than jihadists or Islamists. So, these groups are groups of guys with guns and motorcycles who live in the forest and attack villages, mostly in the Muslim North, massacre and kidnap for ransom across the country. So that kind of puts it in perspective. It's as if the folks who are saying Boko Haram's killing 100,000 Christians across the country are living in a world that kind of Boko Haram wished existed 15 years ago, that they were able to have done that, but that isn't what happened.
Stick with me, both of you. When we come back, we'll talk about what the reaction has been to some of the comments President Trump has made and what we're likely to see moving forward from the U.S. president, but also from the Nigerian government. Welcome back. Today, we're looking at President Trump's threat to deploy the military to Nigeria to tackle what he's called, without evidence, systemic attacks on Christians on Nigeria. Nduka Orjino and also Neil Munshi are joining us this week. So, Nduka, what have we heard from the Nigerian government so far?
There was a statement from President Bola Tinubu on Sunday, and he basically said, look, Nigeria is a country that guarantees the religious liberty of citizens. Christians were not being persecuted. And they made the point that Christians and Muslims, have been targeted by these extremist groups, by these armed gangs in Nigeria, sparing no one across religious lines. I thought it was a very measured response. I thought they really fall into the trap of going gung-ho with Trump, almost matching fire with fire, because Nigeria still needs the kind of support that the US can provide in terms of providing military equipment, in terms of providing aid, in terms of providing the kind of economic support that you need to really keep the government's reforms going. So I thought it was a measured response by the government. We've heard that there are scheduled talks between Nigeria's foreign minister and officials in Washington. The foreign minister, told me that 2 weeks ago that they are constantly talking with officials in Washington and that they are on the same page. But that was before Trump made those statements anyway. Things might have changed a little bit, but the impression I got from speaking with the foreign minister was that there are talks ongoing between both sides.
And some people are making the comparison to President Trump's allegations about South Africa and what he said about white Afrikaner farmers and potentially sort of the tussle that we saw between President Ramaphosa and President Trump eventually. Neil, what's the risk here if we take a look at President Tinubu's response, as Nduka just pointed out, quite measured? What is the risk here, though, especially if we look at the current situation that he's dealing with domestically?
Yeah, I think, to that point, the measured response is kind of the only play with Trump because he's shown, for a long time that he doesn't back down from a claim once he's made it, no matter what evidence is shown to refute it. So the example of South Africa, where he claims there's a genocide against white people against all the available evidence, is kind of exactly the situation Nigeria is finding itself in now. And it's going to be tricky. And I don't think South Africa has fully figured this out yet. And, we're many months in to their situation. To placate Trump, communicate to your people and the world that this is not true, and maintain relations in a way that Trump is able to save face and probably continue to repeat these false claims. I don't think it's going to be easy for them to navigate, but I think this measured response is kind of the only way to do it. And I think, Tinubu's pretty well placed to talk about religious pluralism in Nigeria because he's a Muslim who was governor of Lagos State in the predominantly Christian South. He's married to a Christian woman who is also a pastor. For all his faults in tackling insecurity in Nigeria, he kind of embodies that religious pluralism in many ways.
That's really fascinating. So then what do we watch out for now? As you mentioned, South Africa is still trying to figure it out. And Nduka, maybe you can start for us. What are you paying close attention to?
Well, for the escalations, we've seen meetings. Yesterday, the Nigerian president had a cabinet meeting, and that was followed by another meeting by his national security advisor and the service chiefs that were just recently appointed. I wouldn't necessarily consider that a response to Trump's rhetoric, but we'll be looking for any further escalations if perhaps the US decides to begin moving military assets towards the West African coast. Then that will be a point in time when we can then say, well, this is really getting serious. I do not think we'll get to that point. I think it's Trump's rhetoric. And I think that in the transactional nature of politics in Washington these days, there can be some trade-off between the Nigerian government, and folks in Washington. Nigeria refused U.S. application to take in some of the illegal migrants the country was going to send. That could be back on the cards now. Nigeria has some minerals that Trump might be eyeing. So these are things that Abuja could really use to appease Donald Trump. But I don't think there'll be the kind of military escalation that Trump has hinted.
Perhaps there's a resource transaction in the pipeline. Neil?
I kind of would say the same thing. If we see aircraft carriers and that kind of thing in the Gulf of Guinea, we'll know that he is taking this as far as he has the Venezuela situation. I don't think that's in the cards either, because I don't think it's sort of at the heart of U.S. policy or his policy, the way that Venezuela and the drug trade are. I think, the most likely thing is in the months to come as we see kind of trade deals and that kind of thing. The Nigerian government can say we're very happy to accept U.S. help in tackling the scourge of Islamism, which, to be fair, like U.S. troops have been training Nigerian troops for years. That's been ongoing. And, on the other side, maybe they can offer U.S. companies access to their largely untapped lithium reserves or other minerals in the country.
And you can read Neil Munshi and Nduka Orjino's report on Bloomberg platforms now. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Here's some of the other stories from the region we've been following this week. Guinea's military leader Mamadi Doumbouya will stand as a candidate in the country's first presidential elections since he seized power in a coup 4 years ago. And AI-powered fintech firm Optasia Group rallied in its debut on the Johannesburg Bourse that marked the nation's biggest initial public offering this year. Optasia's successful debut could set a trend for other fintech firms considering bourse listings and help re-energize market sentiment on the JSE. And you can find these stories on Bloomberg platforms now, including in the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. But for now, I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.